G'day guys and welcome to Beyond the Political Spin, episode 4. Today we're actually doing things a little bit different. I know we had a couple of topics scheduled for today's episode, but we're actually going to focus on the federal budget that was announced just a couple of days ago. So we've had quite a few people hit us up on the Facebook page and social media wanting us to break it down for them. So that's what we're going to do today. Stay tuned. Hopefully it's informative and you get a lot out of this one, and we'll break it down piece by piece.
Welcome to Beyond the Political Spin, your weekly dose of politics, economics, common sense, and things that matter. No lefties, no political correctness, no agenda, no bullshit, and absolutely no political spin. Here's your last line of defence for common sense. Adrian Aiello, Vince Lochisano, and Richard Stockman.
Alrighty, so guys, before I get Vince involved, I'm actually just going to take you through, I suppose, key elements of economics that people need to understand, and those who, don't usually have interest in it, but want to know, want to start to understand certain things, because obviously we're in a time now where everything seems so much more important. So, some of these are things that people have messaged and want us to explain, and it's okay if people don't understand certain things. We're by no means experts, but are passionate about it, so we can kind of break a few things down for you. The first one that is quite common is about government debt, and what is government debt and what's deficit. So basically, government debt is when the government borrows money to pay for the business of the government, providing welfare, funding schools, roads, keeping the army freshly stocked with guns and ammunition, all that type of thing, which incurs a lot of expense for the national budget, but also for the nation as a whole. It's basically the running of the government if you look at it from a business point of view. So you've got all these outlays or all these proposed expenses. Now, where are you going to get the money from? So we do that through collecting taxes. There's, levies on income, personal income tax, profits via shopping with GST. So that's one way. There are a few ways we get the money back in terms of the government raising the funds to cover the expenses. Now, if in a year the government raises more money than it spends, that's when the government is said to be in surplus. So we actually haven't heard that very much at all over the past couple of decades, but the last government to actually get us into surplus, so we eliminated the debt and we're actually in surplus, not just for the budget, but as a nation's economy, was the Howard government. So I think that there's been 3 governments that actually got us into surplus, but the last being the Howard government. But in terms of the budget, if the annual budget, so they're basically collecting more money than they're spending, it's said to be in surplus. So that's where you'll hear that. Again, in turn, if revenue falls short of the spending, so if they're planning on spending X amount of money, but the money they're collecting and raising falls short of that, the budget is then said to be in deficit, which we hear a lot. So, each year the budget is in deficit. That means the government has to borrow the difference, adding to the total stock of outstanding debt. So, if you hear like this year, we're obviously in quite a significant deficit, and that money has to then be borrowed. So following from that, we then have the question that a lot of people ask, and that's how much does our government owe, right? Which is very, very significant, because this is what we carry for years and years and years and often generations. So we're now approaching like historical debt, which means, these generations ahead are going to carry it through their years. So at the beginning of April, government debt stood just shy of, I think, 600 billion. Now we've just topped 800 billion. So that's about 40% of our total output, economic output, or GDP. And that's rising every week. So it's, lockdowns and COVID disruptions, everything we've seen through the COVID pandemic, that's all hurt the government's budget in a huge way. And that's on both the spending and on the income side of the budget. So on the expenditure side, payments have gone through the roof, and that comes in the way of JobKeeper and JobSeeker, and any other welfare payments. We've had the coronavirus supplements and all that type of thing. So that's just skyrocketed, and obviously been a huge detriment to the budget naturally. But in time of crisis, that had to be done, right? On the income side, and this is probably where people forget, so we all know that obviously the government's spending all this money with welfare payments, but what people don't realise is it hurts the income side, because when you're going through a crisis like this, you've got tax receipts from incomes, there's profits, consumption, they've all plummeted. So you've got a lot of people out of jobs, which means they're paying less income tax. So it's, less money in the household, less household spending, which means less GST. Like, it's just a domino effect, and it carries on. So there's a lot of elements, you'll think of it yourself. If you actually take the time and actually think about, all right, where does the government earn money off my everyday living? You'll think, all right, well, all these people are out of jobs and businesses are closed. So there's businesses that are not paying tax because they're not earning money, and it's just a massive chain effect. And it's, it really, really affects the economy. And that's how the economy hurts so badly, because it's not just the expenditure, but it's also the income. So not only are you outlaying so much more money than you ever would, you're not getting it back either. So that's where we see these massive deficits in budgets after crises and recessions and things like that, when the government needs to give us all a lifeline. But when you do compare it on the global chart, we actually compare quite well. Canada's government are projected to owe about 190% of Canada's annual economic output next year. France sit at about 116%, Germany 66%, Italy 150%, Japan 248%, and United Kingdom 96%. And then you've got the US, which are projected to sit at about 132% of GDP. So we're actually doing pretty well, right? In the scheme of things, we're doing pretty well. The next question that always comes about, and we had a few people asking us if we can explain. A lot of people often ask, how does the government borrow money? Where do they get the money from if there's a debt, if there's a deficit in the budget? Now, some people may think they just print it at the mint. Well, that's absolutely not true. They don't just print it. They borrow money just like you and I. So as we go to the bank to buy a home loan, because we don't have $800,000 sitting in the bank, the government do the same. So when there's a deficit in the budget, they do the same. They borrow from the banks, from superannuation companies and all that. So what there is that within the Treasury Department, there's a special agency, and that's called the Australian Office of Financial Management. Now, the AOFM, as it's known, is responsible for holding regular auctions. And what that is, it's where potential lenders who want to lend to the government, they turn up, it's all online, they turn up and they nominate what interest rate they're willing to accept in return for their money. And it goes for a few minutes. And there was one in late September, actually, where the government borrowed $2 billion, and the average interest rate for that was at 0.12%. So pretty cheap, but I think the loan term for that one, if I recall, was about 4 months. So it's actually a good little thing to understand and see how, they do get their money, but understanding that they just, whenever there's a debt, and this is how important it is that we try and minimise the debt of the country, because it's borrowed and interest is paid on that, just like we pay when we get a mortgage. So, and there's a lot of economies around the world. Greece is one that it's kind of commonly spoken about, and that's because they're at a point where they can't even pay the interest back. Like their debt is so astronomical that they're never going to, it's almost at a point where they'll never ever pay it back, and because they can't even keep up with interest, let alone the principal being the actual debt amount. So these auctions, they happen probably a couple of times a week, and they continue to do so, and they will continue to do so, for as long as the government is in deficit or shortfall, basically. So that'll just continue along. Now, in reference to that, there's also, we want to know who lends to the money to the government. So as I said before, the answer is, big banks, super funds, international pension funds, investors, central banks. They're all the types of entities that lend money to the government. So at any given time, there's always money being invested around the world, particularly through regular contributions to super funds and pension funds. And all that money needs to go somewhere, basically. So they're happy to lend to the governments because they promise to give it back plus interest. And obviously, being a government, they're typically very reliable and can largely be trusted to repay. So that's hence why all these lenders are so happy to lend to a government in bulk amounts. So just before I get Vince to join in and we actually break down the budget, but a couple of things that are mentioned in the budget that are quite important for business and sole traders, and some people may not understand how it actually works. So I just want to break them down first before we move into the actual budget. So one of the big things of the budget, and directly affecting small to medium business especially, as well as your sole traders, and that is the instant asset write-off threshold increase. So what that means is, basically, if we put it simply, the instant asset write-off, the provisions allow your business to claim an immediate tax deduction for the full cost of a business asset you buy. So normal depreciation requires you to deduct the cost against your business profits over a number of years, depending on the asset. So it's depreciated over maybe 5 years or 3 years, whatever it may be. Now, under the new rules, it means that you can claim a tax deduction in the same financial year that you purchase new or secondhand equipment. Now, the threshold has been raised from $30,000 to $150,000, right? So don't think of it as a cash refund. If you go spend $100,000 on a piece of equipment, you're not going to get $100,000 back. The government isn't buying you the equipment. But what it is you get the timing advantage of bringing it forward as a tax deduction rather than receiving it over several tax years. It may not appeal to the average Joe Blow if you're not spending much money or you don't have the funds to go out and buy any equipment. But for those who need equipment and have somewhat profitable business, it's actually quite beneficial because you are getting that reduction of your profits. So if that then brings you into a lower tax bracket, you can be saving quite a large amount of money. So one other thing that comes up a lot is GDP. Now, GDP is gross domestic product, and it's been coming up a lot because it's spoken about, especially during times like this where GDP becomes such an important factor in the economy. And a lot of people just simply don't know what it is. And put simply, it is the market value of all the goods and services produced in Australia. Right? So all the goods and services that are produced in the country, in a country's borders, that's classified as your gross domestic product. So when economists talk about the size of an economy, they often refer to GDP. Right? That's what they're referring to. So on GDP also then comes talk about economic contraction, which I'm sure also you would have heard a lot about lately. And this is because Australia has seen our economy contract for a couple of quarters now, which it is said that if an economy contracts in 2 quarters or more, it's then classified as a recession. So that's hence why the federal government came out a couple of months ago and announced that Australia was, or a month ago, time is hard to keep track of at the moment, but they announced that Australia was officially in recession because that's how it's classified. So when your economy contracts for 2 quarters, that's how it's classified as being in a recession. So an economic contraction is basically a decline in the national output. So this is why it refers back to the GDP, because your output, your economic or your national output is measured by the GDP, the gross domestic product. So these things, they include, like a drop in personal income, industrial production, retail sales, and in turn that then increases things like unemployment rates. So basically, companies stop hiring because they have to save money and face the lower demands. Toward the middle of a contraction, they then start laying off workers, sending up employment rates even higher. So, that's what we're starting to see, but not so badly at the moment because we are kind of we've got a Band-Aid approach at the moment with JobKeeper and JobSeeker that's keeping a lot of people employed. So the true test for our contraction is probably going to be post JobKeeper when, businesses are then left to pay for the staff themselves, basically based on their demands and their level of business at the time. So that's going to be the big test for us, I think, moving on from April next year when we see the end of JobKeeper, we're going to see the true economic state here in Australia. The contraction is one of the 4 phases of business cycle. So for anyone that knows, you might have heard people say the boom and bust cycle. So basically it starts off as a boom where your economy is booming, or in business cycle terms, it's called expansion. You've then got your end of boom, or again, in business cycle terms, it's called the peak. So that's when your economy, obviously, got your expansion first, and then you get to the point where it's just absolutely peaking. It's really thriving, but it's also about to burst at the seams. And then following on from that, you've got your bust, which is your contraction, which is what we're seeing now. At the end of the contraction or end of the bust is what we call the trough, which is kind of your lowest point, and that's just before we then go back into expansion. So, the economy stops contracting and it starts to expand again. The one aspect for me that I have a lot of concern about is just, thinking about the end of JobKeeper and where a lot of businesses currently find themselves. And, I've got a lot of clients myself, or people I know in the hospitality industry and other corporate industries that, kind of advise that the demand is so low at the moment that post, all the COVID supplements such as JobKeeper, that they're most likely going to have to retrench a lot of their staff, which, it just scares me to see where the true unemployment rate is going to sit come April. Just quickly, Vince, I just really want people to understand how important and how crucial to the economy the private sector is. 8 out of 10 jobs are employed by the private sector. Just think about that. 8 out of 10 jobs in the private sector. So if that doesn't tell you how important it is that the federal government, the state government support small to medium business, it is so crucial to the livelihoods of you out there that are listening. Most of you will work for the private sector. For those who don't, well, good for you, because you've most likely got quite a secure job. But for those in the private sector, they're the jobs and the businesses and the people that are always most affected by economic crises, and any economic sort of strain hits them first, right? So the fact that we have 8 out of 10 people employed by the private sector is enormous. So I've got a friend of mine who owns and operates 7 dealerships in Melbourne, right? 7 car dealerships in Melbourne. Now, I won't name them because they are quite well known, but they average 60 staff per dealership. Now, you do your maths. 60 staff per dealership. That's about 400 staff, 400 people from one business owner. Don't criticize his wealth. What you should be doing is praising his contribution to the Australian economy. This bloke started from nothing, got into the first dealership, and then had great success because of hard work and because of the hard work of his employees and the success that his employees had that in turn gave him success as well. But his wealth come from a whole shitload of sacrifice, massive risk, okay, to keep people employed and employ. If we could go back, they've been in business for about 30 years. If we could go back more, possibly, if we went back and calculated, all the people he's employed. This is 400 people at one given time. What about the people he's employed over all these decades? Okay? This is how important private business is. So I know a couple of people that have been retrenched from, big, not small, say medium business. And, they think, oh, how can you do that? The boss is so wealthy, and times are tough for everybody. Now, if these people don't protect themselves and the wealth they've got today, then there is no business moving forward. There is no 400 staff to employ moving forward. So before we criticize people because of their wealth, let's take a moment to understand their contribution to society and to the key economic factors. It's just one thing I wanted to make note because it comes up in conversation a lot, and it's just people need to understand the bigger picture before they criticize one's wealth and success, because it bothers me a lot, and it's just a simple lack of education and understanding of that bigger picture. So let's carry on anyway. All right, so as I mentioned a couple of things before, Vince, while you were quite quiet, we'll just cover it off again. So predicted debt and deficit, obviously they're ballooned since the July economic update, but gross debt, it's expected to hit a peak of 1.1 trillion in June 2024, which is approximately 51% of GDP. Deficit in this budget is expected to peak at 213 billion. So that's this year before I think Frydenberg has announced that it's expected to rapidly decrease in the following years. Unemployment is not expected to peak as high as previously estimated. So it's now slated to hit at 8% in the December quarter. So they're the three key things to, I suppose, take out of the overview of the budget, and the three most important things being what deficit we're carrying, and also unemployment being the biggest issue in any budget. But first off, with the breakdown, we want to talk about health. So that was something that many people were waiting to hear from Frydenberg in regards to health, and what he said here. So I've got 3 dot points here that we want to talk about. Australians accessing mental health services will get a boost with the number of Medicare supported appointments, with a psychologist doubling from 10 to 20. So at the moment, you can have 10 visits with a psychologist. Now he's increased that given the COVID circumstances. We've seen an increase of that to 20, which is actually great to see. Telehealth services will receive $112 million for people to access medical appointments remotely. Obviously, again, continuing on post-COVID until we open things up completely. States and territories stand to receive a further $1.1 billion for hospitals as part of the COVID-19 response, along with $750 million for testing. The government has also committed $1.7 billion towards a COVID-19 vaccine, which we're all anticipating.
Well, a lot of this budget really is dependent upon the government having a vaccine.
Correct.
Or Australia having a vaccine in place, and all of this is really all up in the air if that doesn't happen.
Yeah, well, it's there's still no certainty. I know it's been spoken about for quite a long time, when we're going to see it. We had some times there that we thought it was going to be a lot sooner than we hoped, but certainly
all I can say is I hope they're very confident, for good reason, that one's going to become available next year, because if it doesn't happen,
I can't see
a lot of this is
going to prolong,
potentially all up in the air.
Yeah, I agree.
But isn't it amazing, some of the figures you just quoted there? We have effectively doubled the national debt in 1 year.
Absolutely.
Well, in one set of figures, we're basically up at around $500 billion, which is around 500 odd, billion, which is actually 500,000 million. It's crazy numbers, isn't it? And now we're looking at an overall national debt exceeding 1,000 million.
To think Pablo Escobar
which is
had
1,000 billion.
Pablo Escobar had that much in a safe.
Yeah, I think you can even get to the point with some of these figures where $1 billion here and $1 billion there doesn't really
even
make
matter.
any impact anymore.
It
and I think that's what a lot of these politicians do lose sight of. the actual amount of money we're talking about.
Well, we saw that with Frydenberg when Josh Frydenberg overestimated the JobKeeper
130 billion they thought it was going to cost, and it ended up being half
70.
that much.
So we had a saving of 60 billion, and it wasn't even, no one cared for it.
Yeah, but what was compelling for me when that happened was how quickly the opposition parties all wanted to start spending it again. Why can't we save it?
And this is
that's the mentality in this country,
and
man.
that's what I tried to touch on before, is the fact that it's not money that was just saved and it's still sitting there. Now, what do we do with it? It's less money that the country needed to borrow. Yeah. So it's pretty crucial that we all understand that. But
Crazy.
One thing I don't if we want to put it under the health side of things, is pensioners are going to receive two $250 payments, one in December and one in March. Now, that's on top of the previous coronavirus supplements payments they received, which was, I think most people have received $750 twice. So
it's not just pensioners, it's disability recipients and all sorts of other people that get that sort of welfare.
Now, I know it's touchy, Vince, but this is the one that I don't understand. And I couldn't understand it when the pensioners received the $750 in two lots, so $1,500 total.
Yep.
What's your view on that? Because I just, for me, we want to look at after our vulnerable, but to me, the pensioners, their life has not changed. Like what?
Call it a comfort payment. Here's an extra $500 for you.
That's a lot of money.
Well,
that is a lot of spending.
Yeah,
but I just don't
another
see
$2.6 billion.
Should that money not have gone into small to medium business rather than
keep handing it out
to pensioners who, let's face it, nothing's changed through this crisis for them.
Well, if you're going to do that, you'd think that you'd have to extend that sort of generosity to unemployed people or people on job seeker, for example, because they're in need of work.
At the end of the day, the pension is a welfare payment.
Well, the pension is a welfare payment, but there's no prospect of any pensioners going back to work in that sense. It's basically, okay, you've reached that stage in your life. This is what you're going to receive per week for the rest of your life. Now, I don't have an issue with improving the pension as an overall payment in line with indexation and all that sort of thing. But this is just a straight out once off or twice off in this case.
Twice off, yeah.
Payment. It's a gift.
Well, it's now a total of $2,000. So you got
now $2,000.
$750, $750, $250, $250. And
if someone can make the case that pensioners have suffered or disability, welfare support payment recipients have, because of the COVID crisis, had to undergo additional expense to their lives. Yeah. Well, then, I think you can.
It can be justified,
but I haven't heard anyone actually do that.
No, I haven't, and it's just. Not a great issue. I think there's, in the scheme of things, it's not a massive issue, but one that when we had two $750 payments, it's quite a deficit to the budget.
Well, I would have thought that they would have already been quite happy having received those two $750 payments without expecting another two $250 payments. Yeah. So really, that was a bit of a bonus for them that I don't think anyone necessarily expected.
Yeah, I agree.
Maybe it's being done for political reasons to keep the aged and the disabled on side with the government. I don't know. There's maybe a bit of politics in there.
Yeah, I probably think so too. All right, moving along, we've got education. So they announced a couple of things with education. Mm-hmm. The government extended its previously announced $1 billion job trainer program with 100,000 new apprenticeships and traineeships costing an additional $1.2 billion. Businesses that employ these apprentices or trainees will be offered a 50% wage subsidy by the government. The decimated university sector has been offered $1 billion in a lifeline to fund new research. And there will also be 12,000 new Commonwealth-supported places in higher education in 2021.
Yes, undergraduate university places is what they're providing.
Correct.
An additional 12,000 of those at a cost of about $300 million. So they're doing bits and pieces in every area you can think of. It's a massive spend.
Yeah,
It's there's eye-watering figures that we're having to digest here. And look, I look at it this way: if Australia was a human body, it was a human being, quite a healthy human being, come March this year, all of a sudden it's been put into a self-induced coma.
Yep.
Okay, by the government, not because of poor economics or anything like that, or bad policies, purely because of this health scare. The Australian economy has been put into a self-induced coma by the government.
Well, we were quite healthy.
And now that
before
we're learning a lot more about the threat of the virus, and maybe putting a few more things into perspective, I would have thought, although some state premiers haven't done so yet, the federal government is now looking to revive that human body by literally, just like someone whose heart has stopped, putting in a defibrillator and trying to kickstart it through an electric shock. Now, what they're doing with this budget is hoping that by, first of all, giving people a big injection of funds through tax cuts and various other people handouts, that will inject a lot of money into the economy, and then that will get the whole thing started. As well as that, they're looking to spend money on their own projects, government-funded projects, and kick things off that way as well. But it's really a combination of tax cuts on one hand and big spending and a lot of investment into various parts of the economy to try and kickstart it again.
Yeah, I like. It was always going to be about jobs and business, and I think rightly so. And I think they needed to do that, and that's what I loved about this budget.
Well, I think I made a comparison with the situation from 11, 12 years ago now, when the so-called global financial crisis hit. Now, what the Labor government under Kevin Rudd did back then was to try and stimulate the economy by literally giving it a sugar hit, but in, I guess, typical Labor fashion, through government-funded programs like the Pink Bats disaster and the school halls disaster. Yet again, poorly thought out. It was trying to give the economy a sugar hit. It was never going to create any lasting employment. It was never going to create any real, genuine, economic activity that's going to be an ongoing and sustainable thing. So at least in this case, the Liberal Party has been true to its values. It's saying, no. Rather than us spending taxpayers' money, willy-nilly, we'd rather give the individual people of Australia their own money back through tax cuts, and that they can spend it as they see fit into the economy, and that will help boost business and create more jobs.
Yeah, and the funding, like putting the funding into apprenticeships and traineeships too, is pretty important, because I think that's where those initiatives went wrong. Like, if we talk about the Pink Bats, they were giving those jobs were taken up by every Tom, Dick and Harry, it was never going to be sustainable, because once it was done, it was done. These people had no qualifications. They had nothing to sustain their employment. So that was a total disaster. But one thing,
and it killed a few people too along the way.
Absolutely, it did, and that comes with that, without the qualifications. But one thing I find it's great to put all this money in there, but I think the rest of the country needs to follow, because they need to work hand in hand. If you've got this money pouring into certain elements of the economy, but then you've got certain states that are closing off borders or dragging their lockdowns on longer than they should, it doesn't work together, right? Yep. So this is a great budget.
Yep.
But it needs the rest of the country to pick up the slack and get back to business as well, because otherwise it's just not going to work.
It could be a largely wasted amount of money. I mean, it's an enormous amount of money if the states don't get on board and start helping to kickstart their own individual economies, rather than keeping them locked down for the sake of a handful of COVID cases. It's just defies belief how you can justify, at the cost of somewhere around $100 million a day in Victoria,
it's ridiculous,
to continue keeping everyone shut down for the sake of a handful of cases. Now, you can manage them. I think New South Wales is the shining light that proves to us that even with mild amounts of cases, when I say mild amounts, somewhere between, 0 and 20 odd cases a day, you can still manage them, you can still trace them, and you can still get on top of them without shutting down your economy. How these other premiers, like the ones in Victoria and Queensland and WA, continue to shut their economies down and close their borders, more to the point. The shutting down of the economy is more in Victoria. But even in Queensland, where people can move around, tourism's in big trouble.
That's what I mean. The closure of borders it's just as bad as shutting down an economy, Vince. The amount of cost.
Well, it is for a lot of industries.
Oh, absolutely. Tourism, it's the biggest hit. It's and that brings a lot of money to every economy, every state and territory economy.
Yep.
Now, I did like, though, that he was pretty firm on saying, as we go back to, they need to pick up the slack and move along as well. He was pretty, when he talked about the infrastructure and the funding into the states and territories, he did go to the effort to make an actual point there of saying that if the states do not move quickly,
they'll lose it.
They'll lose the funding. It'll go to other states. So I think we might see finally a little bit of some muscle flex by the federal government. And hopefully we do, so that they can, kind of force them to step up to the plate and get back to business as well. Because if they don't pick up the slack, they simply lose the funding, which is, I think, needs to be done.
Well, frankly, I think this should have been done a lot earlier. And state governments who continue to expect the federal government to just throw money at them and to keep funding, I think most of them get at least half of their revenue from the federal government in one way, shape or form.
Yep.
And if they're not prepared to play ball in a national sense and do what's in the national interest, okay, and stop thinking just within their own little bubble of what's best for them in Queensland or what's best for them in WA, if they don't want to start playing ball by what's best for the country, I think that sort of threat is more than justified. Okay, you want to do your own little thing? That's fine. You lose your funding.
Yeah, and it's a hard one because obviously that's where the Constitution is. In the sense that you've got different parties in control of different states, and it's just what you see over in America and many other places around the world. But as the big picture, yes, you need that because obviously otherwise you've got one controlling government that just does what they want. So I understand that. The problem is, if they continue to run in line with their own political party and not in the national interest of the country, that's where we kind of see these things where they look after their own state and territories only because of the political agenda. Which,
well, of course, what did the Queenslanders say?
How do we avoid that, Vince?
What did the Queenslanders say in response? Well, it's very unfortunate that the federal government's playing politics with this and, but that's not going to dissuade us from doing what's in the Queenslanders' best interest. We will always keep making decisions that are, going to keep them safe and secure. Yeah. It's so pathetic that there are still people that cannot get into Queensland who need to get there for work, need to visit loved ones, need to visit their sick and elderly parents or people that are going to die. They can't go and see them.
Yeah, I think enough is enough now.
And honestly, I've noticed last week that the polls are looking like Labor's still ahead in Queensland, which makes me just shake my head. I can't understand how people could tolerate that sort of treatment of people. But anyway, hopefully there's a bit of wriggle room in those polls, but how this government can get away with that sort of treatment of people and yet still allow the AFL, famous actors, and give all sorts of exemptions to people, as the chief health officer said, because they bring money into the state. That's just a disgraceful position to take, and I just don't understand how anyone could vote for that and look at themselves in the mirror.
I think we need to put ourselves in the shoes
have
of these families, these wives that can't go see their dying husbands, or Families that can't see their dying fathers and mothers, and it's all that it's just unforgivable, I think, especially in the time we're in now when we're seeing such low case numbers across the country. There is absolutely no reason for that.
See what's happened here? New South Wales just yesterday, all of a sudden have discovered three little three cases. There's a little outbreak somewhere. And because of that, it's going back to zero in terms of having 28 days in a row, because these are the ridiculously high bars that Palaszczuk has set for New South Wales in order to reopen the Queensland-New South Wales border. Oh, we've got to have 28 days of no cases at all. So all of a sudden, New South Wales has got a little case, bang, you're back to zero. Now, it'll mean literally that the border will never reopen on that basis. It's just shameful how they can continue to pursue this line. Someone's got to stop them. In this case, I hope it's the Queensland electors and kick out that shambolic government on the 31st of October.
Well, let's hope there is a silent majority there that...
And by the way, flush it down the toilet and I'll donate the Domestos. Just vote them out, please. They're a disgrace.
It's very, very true. We're getting carried away, but we'll move on to infrastructure because this is where the funding come in for the state and territories as well. But so announcements of a $7.5 billion investment in transport infrastructure and $2 billion in road safety upgrades, bringing the government's infrastructure commitment to more than $14 billion for new and accelerated projects since the pandemic began. Roads and railways will be the focus of upgrades, with major projects slated across all states and territories. The government expects 40,000 jobs to be supported by increasing the Commonwealth's 10-year infrastructure pipeline. All right, so quite a bit of spending there on infrastructure, Vince. What are your thoughts here? Obviously, creating quite a few jobs. And hopefully accelerating some of the major projects in states and territories.
Again, some of these projects are costing billions of dollars. $14 billion in new and accelerated infrastructure projects over the next 4 years in every state and territory, including Melbourne to Brisbane Inland Rail and Western Sydney International Airport. They're big projects.
Massive projects.
And they are needed. What I like about it is it's targeted at areas that the country needs.
And
you know what I'm saying?
And he's requiring them to move fast as well, which is really good. I hope he does continue to put the pressure on the states and territories to get them to move on these projects as well.
I mean, if infrastructure is invested in by the federal government using taxpayers' money, obviously, that will make business more productive, it'll make travel more efficient, it'll make everyday life for people more comfortable or more efficient in whatever ways, well then by all means let's do it if it's required. And then you can justify using taxpayers' money to do that. There's a benefit that will last for years on end.
Correct,
What I don't like is like that Pink Bats program or like that school halls program, they are not projects that will have an ongoing benefit for many, many years to come, especially when half of them didn't even need it. They're ill thought out in terms of what the country really needs. Who would have said that putting pink bats in houses is the top priority in the country, or that decking out school halls in schools, some of which didn't need it or want it in the first place? Why should that be at the top of the priority list? Let's get the priorities right in terms of where this infrastructure is required and invest it there. That's when most reasonable people can say, okay, I can understand why they're doing that. I can understand why we're going into debt in order to achieve that outcome.
And it also creates sustainable jobs, which is quite important.
And it'll help more businesses actually thrive and survive and et cetera. So it's all about investment for a return. You need a return on that investment. A lot of projects in the past have been ill thought out, and the return on investment is almost negligible. It was more done to sort of service the needs of the union movement, who just want to get more people employed and more union fees coming in.
It was just a complete deficit with no return.
So I mean, look, I welcome the infrastructure spending, and I think most people would.
I think it's been targeted well. Like the projects they've outlined for the funding are certainly projects that are required by
Yep.
by those states and territories.
Yep. And don't forget, there's also examples in the environment. For example, there's infrastructure in gas and all that sort of thing. That's
well, we may as well
invested in.
cover that now. So energy and environment was a big topic, and I think a lot of people were waiting to hear. So if I can cover off a few dot points here, we've got so there's a low emission energy sources and renewable technologies will get a $1.9 billion boost in a bid to address impacts of climate change. We have an additional $1.8 billion that was announced for the environment, including $250 million to modernise the nation's recycling infrastructure. National parks, including Kakadu and Uluru, will receive $233 million, while $47 million will be put towards restoring the health of oceans. $2 billion will be injected into building new water infrastructure.
Yep.
I think I like what they're doing with the recycling, actually. And I'm not normally one to advocate for things like this, but so what they're doing is actually banning the export of plastic, paper and glass waste. So investing that $250 million to modernise recycling, and that's going to create 10,000 jobs, which is, I think, a great initiative there as well.
Yep. Well, it's our waste, it's our problem.
Yeah, correct.
No more should we be, exporting that, so to speak, over to other countries.
So they also announced a $2 billion. So they also announced $2 billion of new funding to increase the national water grid, which I think is great news for the agricultural sector and obviously farmers and regional tourism as well. And I think
we have to look after our farmers.
Yeah, I think that was probably the biggest thing I take away from that whole energy environment.
If we don't look after our agriculture sector, we won't be able to produce our own food.
Yeah.
Let alone export it. And that's got to be treated with, in my opinion, a high level of priority every year.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just the livelihoods. Like, we all know how tough these farmers do it. They face drought, they face floods, they face a lot of detriment that is caused by the environment. But not only is it their livelihoods, it's a production of what we eat.
Yep.
What we buy, our groceries, produce. So it is super, super important that we do look after the farmers and regional areas. And
I will stick my neck out in this area.
Yep.
And that is in terms of agricultural land ownership. I personally don't want to see any Australian real estate sold to countries like China. Especially countries like China, because they are owned, a lot of these companies, or if they're not owned, they're funded by the Chinese Communist Party. I'm sorry, but I just don't feel comfortable with that whole idea of our land being sold to overseas interests of that nature especially. But frankly, if I was in charge of this country, I wouldn't allow any of that land to be sold overseas at all. It should always remain in Australian hands. That's my personal view. But I think not everyone will agree with that.
No, I think most people will have that agreement with
a lot of people don't. And so a lot of people do, but if they happen to be an owner of a piece of land and they can sell it for a premium to some overseas Chinese-based company, all of a sudden they want to sell it because they're going to get a premium for it.
Yeah, that's just
well,
what I
I'm
was
sorry,
about to say.
but in the national interest, I would limit the buyers to being Australians or Australian-owned companies. Full stop.
Yep.
And the minute it changes ownership in terms of that company changing its ownership, well, then it's not allowed to own that piece of real estate anymore. It should be able to be sold up by the Australian government at its discretion. The minute that company becomes either wholly owned as a subsidiary of another foreign-owned company, or its own shareholders stop becoming Australians and all of a sudden sell their shares to someone else overseas, that's when that piece of land should be automatically sold off straight away.
I agree with that. And like I said,
that's my personal view on it.
Yeah, no, totally. And I'm in totally
I'm sick of us selling the backyard. And one day, if this is not treated as a serious issue, we will look back and say, oh my God, look how much of our country is now owned by overseas interests.
Yep.
You can't sell off the farm and then expect to control it. It's both sides of politics have been negligent in this area, in my view. I'm all for foreign investment in terms of investing into businesses here and employing Australians within those businesses to create a product and make a profit and provide jobs and do all of those things, fine, but not sell off the asset. They shouldn't be able to own the asset of the real estate.
Okay, so the wage subsidies
This is one of the biggest features is the tax cuts have been brought forward.
brought forward, yep, from I think 2024.
Yes, I guess at a glance, more than 11 million Australians will receive tax cuts with a permanent cut of $47 a week for high-income earners. Middle-income earners will also receive a one-off $21 with extension of the low and middle-income tax offset into 2020-21. From 2020-21, the upper limit of the 19% personal income tax bracket will rise to $45,000, and the 32.5% marginal tax rate upper threshold will lift from $90,000 to $120,000. So they've basically left the percentages the same. They've lifted the thresholds at which those percentages come in.
Correct.
So you're not going to be paying the higher tax rate
Until you're earning a
higher amount of money. So that's effectively a tax cut.
So it works out to the equivalent of $41 a week for those earning between $50,000 and $90,000, which is quite significant, and about $49 a week for those earning more than $120,000 a year.
Yeah.
So I think that that was one of the biggest things for individuals to come out of the budget.
Yep.
And super important to know.
Basically, they're going to backdate these tax cuts as well back to the 1st of July. Now, by the time this goes through Parliament and is passed, it'll probably be close to Christmas before it effectively becomes law. Now, for those who are expecting a big check for 6 months' worth of tax cuts, that's not going to happen. From the time it becomes law, you will start seeing your pay packet with less tax taken out of it on a monthly basis or fortnightly basis, whatever you get paid from that point onwards. And what you'll get in terms of the first, say it's 6 months, from say 1st of July till the end of the year, you'll get 6 months worth of tax cut once you lodge your tax return at the end of June next year. Then you can put in your tax return and you'll get that 6 months worth of tax cut probably by July, August, whenever it gets paid back to you. So you can receive a little bonus.
Yeah, tax return
next winter.
That's right. Perfect time to pay for the gas bill, Vince.
Yeah. Got my electricity bill the other day. Oh, God. Anyway, so in essence, it means that those earning, say, $50,000 a year will get $1,080 back. Those on $90,000 a year will get $1,215 back. On those on more than $120,000, which is the new threshold for 32.5%, they will get back $2,565. So there's a lot of juicy tax cuts to be enjoyed there, and obviously they're doing this so that all that money gets spent on things, and hopefully that kickstarts the economy again and gets things moving and gets money flowing from individuals into businesses. Businesses then need people, and along come the jobs.
I think also
it's all about jobs. Ultimately,
ease a little bit of the pressure as well for those that may have been, may get back to work but working less hours than they were prior to COVID. So. Anything helps at this stage, and I think it's quite significant for individuals.
Yeah.
With the wage subsidies, so the Treasurer announced the government's new Job Maker program, which will offer businesses a hiring credit to hire 16 to 35-year-old job seekers. Now, the credit will be available for 12 months, and it will pay $200 per week for workers under 30 and $100 a week for workers that are aged 30 to 35.
Yep.
All businesses will be eligible apart from major banks, and Treasury estimates it will support about 450,000 young people.
Well, clearly they're trying to incentivise businesses to employ younger people who have less experience and possibly lesser skills or less qualification than people who have been in the workforce for a long time or a lot longer time. If they didn't do this, they'd probably find that they've got a massive percentage of the younger population that won't be in work, and maybe for many, many years, and they're trying to avoid that sort of scenario where there's young people that are out of work for years on end at a very crucial part of their lives when they're young people. Yep. They're better off to have a job If half of it's got to be subsidised by the federal government, so be it. They're prepared to do that rather than putting them on the dole and having to pay them a full
correct. And I think that's
job seeker payment.
Exactly. That's the important part of this that people need to see. That bigger picture of the alternative, which is if we're not giving these
kids on the street, if we're not waiting for
correct. If we're not offering this hiring credit, where are they then? How many of these people are going to be applying for the dole? Which is at a greater cost and for a longer period of time.
Yeah,
so
potentially not working from say 16 or 17 years of age through to maybe their mid-20s or even closer to 30. So it's a very bad precedence to see happen. And I think that the federal government's done well to identify that something needs to be done to incentivise businesses to take on that sort of employee. Yes, they're higher risk to some extent, but they're also young, they're healthy, they're energetic, they're willing to learn, and I applaud this policy. I think it's a good one.
Yeah, I do too. I think businesses at the moment, if we want to restart the economy, especially small to medium business, they're going to have everything thrown at them to take that fear away from rehiring because. It is a big expense. As a business owner myself, it's terrifying when you get to that point where you need some additional manpower, and you think, all right, we're gonna hire someone.
Yeah.
The fear that you have because the outlay is humongous. It's not just per week. It's over the year. It's a huge outlay. So
don't forget, this all follows Sunday's announcement of expanded training subsidies, with the government pledging to cover half the wages of 100,000 new apprenticeships and traineeships. I think if we can see young people getting into these traineeships and apprenticeships, that gives them a start and it gives them something to go to every day, something to get up for every morning.
And again, it's sustainability. It's sustainable because it ends with a qualification.
Yep. There's a pathway. There's a career pathway. And that's what you need to give people is
it's not a band-aid approach. It is a long-term approach, which is a fantastic initiative there.
Yep. There's one other big one that we forgot to talk about. Two then. One, superannuation, but the other one is for small businesses. Now, for any business with less than $5 billion in turnover, which would be the vast majority of small and medium-sized businesses. So we're basically ruling out the top big companies like massive mining companies and that sort of thing.
Yeah, the big corporations.
Basically all but the top 1% of companies and businesses. They will be able to deduct the full cost of capital assets purchased after budget night and first used or installed by the end of June 2022, which is nearly 21 months away or thereabouts.
18 months ago, yeah.
So I think that's a tremendous incentive for small and medium-sized businesses. They will also be able to apply full expensing to second-hand assets. Okay, businesses earning $50 million to $500 million will be able to do so for assets of less than $150,000. Companies with turnover up to $5 billion will be able to offset losses against previous profits on which tax has been paid to generate a refund.
Yes.
Okay. And that's really the guts of it.
Yep. And there's also, which I touched on earlier in the intro, about the instant asset write-off. So
the instant asset write-off is a real big one, and it gives people an incentive to go and buy equipment, buy things that they would normally have to depreciate over a long period of time. They can write off the full cost of that asset straight away.
Yep.
And I think that's a great way to get people buying things and get the economy turning over again.
Yep, absolutely. And as I covered before, again, just reiterating on that it is actually, don't think you're going to get a refund for that. That's not what an instant asset write-off means. But it is a reduction in your taxable taxable profit, correct?
Yeah, it creates basically
if you've got a profit of $100,000 for the year, for the financial year, and you've spent $20,000 on an asset that you're utilising the instant asset write-off, you'll then only pay tax on the $80,000 of profit. If that brings you down to the lower tax bracket, so for sole traders especially, where you might be at the edge of a bracket or just passing the higher tax bracket, The last thing I want to touch on is actually superannuation, because I think personally it's about time they're made accountable. And I really like the measures that he's put in place here for the superannuation.
This was one of
funds.
the best things to come out of the budget, in my view.
Yeah.
Is the new initiative. In essence, every time you change jobs, you don't have to set up a brand new superannuation account where they're taking fees out of all of these different accounts. You just take your one superannuation account with you whenever you change a job.
Yep.
Now, why wasn't this done years ago?
Yeah, I
it's
don't
going to
understand
save
this.
us all millions and millions and millions of dollars in fees that have so far gone straight into the coffers of these super funds. And I think what they've done here is a brilliant move.
Well, the problem is
overdue.
The onus is on us at the moment. So you've got, you might have been with a workplace for 10 years and you've accumulated a fair bit of super in there, gone to a new workplace, and a lot of people kind of, don't take the interest to actually see what's going on. You sign your employment form, gets you choose a nominated super fund that's chosen by the workplace, and all of a sudden you're accumulating funds in a new super fund. In the meantime, you might be at that new workplace for another 10 years. You've then had 10 years of your old super fund that had a good chunk of money in there that's just been chewed away by
with
fees. At the moment, the onus is on us, but it's about time, I think, these big super funds have the accountability to actually follow the rules.
Yep.
And there's stricter regulations in place for them. So this is estimated to save Australians $17.9 billion. There's currently about $3 trillion in super
enormous
accounts.
amount of money. Nearly $18 billion. When you think about that, $18,000 million.
And that's just in fees.
It's just fees.
That's just in fees.
Unbelievable. If you haven't consolidated your superannuation accounts, everyone out there, do it as soon as you can.
Yeah, I did one years ago because I was
crazy to have all these different super funds.
It was scary once I found out the amount of fees I was paying for a super fund that I wasn't putting any more.
It'll
money
eventually whittle down to nothing.
Yeah, it does, and that's a problem. And that's where if you're in that situation,
and it's your money,
and if you're in that situation, if you go back there after years of not putting any money in, and you've got $1,000 left after having 15, 20 grand in there, it's bad luck.
Yep.
So now it's on the super funds to show some responsibility there as well, which I think is great.
Right.
One thing I nearly forgot about, Vince, but I just want to quickly touch because it's always been, as you know, through events and all that type of thing I do, I try and support our vets as much as possible. But there's $1 billion that's been put into the ADF, and that's defence funding, including a huge amount of funding for veterans in their transition to civilian life, which I think is a great part of the budget and a great initiative. These guys sacrifice so much for us.
Yes.
And we certainly wouldn't have the country we do today if it wasn't for these guys. And I've seen firsthand, so have you, through some of the people we've been lucky enough to partner with and come very close to and hear some good insight from with regard to their own transition to civilian life. And in many cases, it is not easy at all. So this is a great initiative. We need to look after our vets.
Yep. No, here.
So the winners and losers, Vince, let's cover off this quickly before we wrap up the episode. The winners seem to be business, which is rightly so. As I said, we want to restart the economy. That's where the money always needed to go.
Well, put it this way. The recovery must be led by small and medium-sized business. It is the engine room of the economy. If anyone out there thinks that the recovery has to be fueled by government spending,
public sectors,
just keep this in mind. Every bit of money the government spends is not theirs, it's ours. And it just keeps adding to more and more debt in the future. They've done enough of that in this budget as it is.
I do keep bringing it up, but I just want people to understand how important it is because, as we've said many times, 8 out of 10 jobs are employed by the private enterprise, private sector. 8 out of 10 jobs. That's 80% of the workforce.
Yep.
The other winners, obviously pensioners, with their 2 payments of $250 that they'll see in December and March.
Yes.
Mental health, which is also rightly so, given the circumstances and the current state of mental health in Australia.
Well, they've certainly put a lot of money into improving mental health.
Well, and I think that in itself proves and really makes it clear to us how much of a problem it actually is right now. So for the government to be putting so much money into mental health, it's clearly a bigger problem than we can all see.
Yep.
The regions, so regional areas of Australia, with the agriculture injection, I think that's going to be great for farmers and on all those regional towns, especially for tourism.
Yep.
And that's great to see. I think we certainly need to look after the regional areas. The losers. Now, many would say super funds come under that, but I'd probably disregard that very quickly, Vince, because they've been taking advantage of
the party's over
of the people for many, many years. So, yep, absolutely, the party's over there. Universities, they've received $1 billion of boost to research, but no measures to rescue the struggling sector. And I think that's based on the amount of travellers we're not seeing, right?
Well, I mean, if you've shut your borders off to the rest of the world, the universities are clearly not going to be filled with students because they've been relying, as usual, on predominantly Southeast Asian countries, especially China.
Yep.
Yet again,
who pay massive inflated costs for universities.
Yeah, and these universities have become businesses.
Yes,
that's what I object to. They've become more about the business side of what they do rather than the educational part of what they do. Yep. And one day we will discuss what our education departments and what our universities have sunk down to, in my opinion, in terms of what they do and what they provide. Our children, our kids, and our people, and they've lost sight of what's really important because they've got their eye on the almighty dollar, and all of a sudden now they expect the federal government to come and basically bail them out of any losses that they've made because of this pandemic.
I actually think this is a good wake-up call to them personally, because
absolutely they should be looking at their models.
Well, for so many years we've seen so many foreign students getting ahead of our own students. And that's simply based on no other aspect other than the fact that they pay super inflated tertiary fees. So
it is one of the biggest export industries we have.
Yes.
Right? And that's all well and good. I don't have an issue with offering university and tertiary places to people that come from overseas, but not at the expense
of our own
children.
Yep.
That ultimately is, not serving the national interests. You can't justify, the business side of what they want to achieve at the expense of our own kids.
Yep. The other one was parents, which I know a lot of people are kicking up a stink and have been for the last couple of days. There's quite a bit of uproar about it. But the fact that they expected a childcare subsidy or free childcare, and that was no part of the budget. Now, the
Labor Party's come out since and said this is their big selling pitch in response to the budget is that they would provide, inverted commas, free, that's a very dangerous word to use, free childcare for women and for people who want to put their kids in government-funded childcare centres. Well, on what basis should it be free?
I understand that people don't often have that support for people to care for their children while they're working. But I invite other people to leave a comment or something and, kind of come back to us on this issue. But, my argument is why? Why do people expect free childcare? It's we've had a 50% subsidy from the government on a normal basis anyway. So for those working, you get 50% back, which is normal practice. That stands.
Yep.
To expect free childcare, I just don't know where that fits into anyone's life, or why. Why?
Well, look, you could extend this to, how is it that people expect free university courses or free schooling? Nothing comes for nothing. Nothing is for free. If they're not charging you for it, you look at it as it's free, but it's overall going to be at the expense of the taxpayer. And there's only so much taxpayers' money you can, command out of the economy. And if you're not getting it from the taxpayer, you're going to borrow it. And who's ultimately got to pay for the borrowings and the interest on those borrowings? The taxpayer again.
Yep.
And that's what scares me about these numbers that we're seeing now out of this budget. is some of these figures are just mind-boggling compared to even 10 and 12 years ago when we were looking at the global financial crisis. We were slamming the Labor government at the time for getting into deficits of $30 and $40 billion a year when Wayne Swan was the treasurer. Now, I thought he did a poor job as well.
Yep.
But now we're talking about 1 year because of this so-called pandemic. It's over $213 billion in 1 year.
Yeah.
Now, yes, it's extraordinary, and we are in extraordinary and unprecedented times, but how much of this was really necessary? I asked the question. By all means, at the time that it came out, we weren't sure how deadly this virus might be, so we had to shut the thing down, shut the country, close the borders, all of that, and try and minimise the introduction of it into our society via return travellers from either aeroplanes or boats. But when we look back on it now, how much of it has really been necessary? How much overreaction have we had from especially state governments, state premiers and territory chief ministers? And how much cost to the economy and to the average person? And how is that justified?
Yeah. I think there was too much focus on what Band-Aids we can hand out rather than how we get back to business and how we get back to business quickly. I think that's where we saw with the state governments and territory leaders not much of a push to reopen and get business back. And we spoke about it before, how it was looked at it from a point of rather than if you can open, you can open. If you can open safely, you should be open. It was...
If it doesn't need to be open,
close it. Yeah, and I think that's...
The focus was all in the wrong area.
That's the issue here, and that's what's created such a massive massive cost to the economy.
Yep. I mean, really, when you look back on just our situation, our dire situation here in Victoria, I mean, how many businesses could have reopened quite comfortably
safely
with a COVID-safe plan and all that, with social distancing and hand sanitizers and all the rest of the business? Why couldn't that have happened with so many different businesses over the last 6 months that wouldn't have spread the virus any further? In the end, we found out that the whole reason for the virus spreading and spreading again was all because of government stuff-ups.
Yeah.
It wasn't because of the people at all. We've all done the right thing.
And it's reducing the impact. Like the more, if you look at it from a point of view of how many businesses can we keep operating.
The focus should have been
there's less.
If this business can stay open and keep operating safely, and at least give itself a chance of surviving, through this pandemic,
then it should
open.
Yep. The other thing I think that cost the economy so much was the lack of rectification, Vince. Like the initial job seeker program and JobKeeper, which JobKeeper that was funneling through business, which is fine.
Well, is it any surprise to you that the left-wing parties like the Greens and Labor all wanted that to continue ad infinitum?
Well, of course, it's a vote-winning initiative.
Keep throwing the taxpayers' borrowed money at it all.
What I think should have been done, though, I understand initially that we had to implement these welfare payments and these injections through existing systems, because this is what people need to understand as well. For them to get this money out quickly, we already had a job seeker system in place, which aka the dole. Now that was an existing working system. So what they did there was obviously wanted to fund those who lost their jobs, so they get what was it, $550 a week. Now, for those people who deserve to get double because their circumstances have changed, we funneled it through the existing job seeker payment system, which in turn resulted in people that were already unemployed receiving
double,
twice as much money. Now, in the initial stages, it had to be done because to get that money out quickly, you needed to use an existing system, and it's just way too hard and way too time consuming.
The
cost to the economy would have been massive.
It was the most practical way of doing it.
Yeah, to implement a whole new system. But as the time went on, now we've been in lockdown now for 7-8 months, right?
Approaching 7 months.
Now I think this job seeker initiative was announced April or end of March.
End of March.
End of March.
Yep.
That's a long time to rectify these people that probably were getting paid unnecessarily. And we're talking about those that receive double when their circumstances not change. That cost for, 7 months, that's massive. So I think the federal government do have a little bit to answer for there. Just that portion for those who were already on job seeker payments, receiving double for 7 odd months. I'd love to know what that portion of the budget or the deficit.
We all know that the original estimates of everything was 130 billion, and it ended up coming out to 70.
Yeah,
because they made a mistake in the Treasury section. And by the way, that wasn't a Josh Frydenberg mistake. That was the Treasury Department. Okay, correct. So those bureaucrats work for whoever is in place in terms of whether it's a coalition government or a Labor government.
Yep.
It's those bureaucrats, if you like, that made those sorts of errors of calculation. But obviously billions and billions of dollars.
I'd just love to know what that actual portion was, because I think there's been a lot of people that were getting a lot of bonus money, and
they were rubbing their hands to get the same beauty. I got double the dole for doing nothing extra,
while others were suffering.
Yeah, and of course pensioners who got the $750 at the start, and then they got another $750 in July.
Yep.
But seriously, since the best treasurer in the history of Australia left office,
Costello.
along with Peter Costello, along with John Howard as our Prime Minister, since November 2007, we have not had one treasurer who has delivered
a surplus budget.
Yep. Actually delivered that outcome. They've made predictions of it, but they haven't actually delivered the surplus outcome.
Not only did Howard and Costello deliver a surplus budget, we as a nation were carrying no debt. We were in surplus
correct.
As a nation.
Costello had paid back every cent of national debt, plus had a little fighting fund with a few more, quite a few $1 million in there, okay? And that was all squandered almost at the waving of the magic wand that Kevin Rudd, when he got voted in, within 18 months, blew all of that, plus put us back into deficit again.
Yep.
Plus, all of a sudden, the national debt started to rise again.
All in all, I think, Vince, I was actually happy with the budget. I think the money was spent where it needed to be spent, and
it's targeted spending, but it's huge spending. It's
huge spending.
Massive spending.
No one can be happy about the deficit, $213 billion. But look, in the scheme of things, I don't think they could have done much else. Given the year we've had.
Well, if they did nothing, they'd almost be letting the country.
Well, you'd let the country sink. Yeah.
And you can't have that.
There is way too many people that need the lifeline right now.
Yep.
I'm one of them.
Yep.
So there's many other people like myself, and I think it was certainly necessary. I was happy with most of the budget, and I'm sure a lot of people were. Look, thanks for listening. I really hope that our listeners got a fair bit out of this episode today. You certainly called for it. We received a bit of feedback, so that's what we did, and hopefully we broke it down for you in a way that most people and the layman can certainly understand. So again, thanks very much for listening, and we will see you again in episode 5, Vince.
Correct. See you then.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Beyond the Political Spin. Don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Stay connected. Follow us on social media at Beyond Political Spin.